Greetings from the Dark Continent, Conscious Caracal here, or Adams Van Sale. And tonight, I know there are still a lot of unrest and riots and looting going on in my country, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of chaos. But tonight, we're not going to be talking about what's going on around me. We're going to be talking about what was going on around me and my guest during two very important decades that brought us to the today where we are in regards to the world that we're seeing around us. And I think tonight you're going to get some insights in regards to what was happening during those 2 decades that answers the question to a certain degree of how did we get here. So welcome on the show, Apex.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for your time for this very interesting topic. So let's start off with something simple in regards to just laying the foundation. You and me are roughly the same age. We grew up in the same time period, just on different continents. And in regards to these 2 time periods that I've chosen, a lot of people like to look back a little farther in regards to the roots of our situation. But I think a lot of the bricks of the foundation of our present today were laid during these 2 decades, and we're going to see if we can find anything there of interest.
Definitely. I mean, I think that especially in America, the 2000s and 2010s were a period of significant transition. And not in a good way for the country. So I don't, everyone will look back. It's like, I went wrong in 1968 or 1971 or 1776 or whatever. But I do think that, the more recent side definitely needs to be investigated more. I think it's sometimes glazed over.
Absolutely. So let's start off with the first decade of tonight's discussion, the 2010s. That's stretching from just after that year 2000 glitch up until the year 2010, when South Africa had the Football World Cup, or the Americans as they call it, soccer. If you had to do an elevator pitch to someone that didn't experience that time period, how would you describe that first decade of the 2000s?
The first decade of the 2000s, at least in America, was a roller coaster in which the first half you saw a country that was recovering from a stock market crash. And really, it appeared that the economy was booming. Everything seemed to be going up, up, up. Everyone wanted to keep going up. And then it turned out that everything was going up because it was basically one big Ponzi scheme. And then the crash happened. And by 2010, you saw a country that was largely demoralized. I won't necessarily say apathetic, but had largely lost faith in any kind of institutional solution, and was kind of lashing out. And you started seeing the first modern, I guess, of our time period, the first post-Great Recession populist movements, and they don't really bear a ton of resemblance to that of Trump or or Brexit or anything like that. But the Tea Party in the U.S. and other similar groups really began emerging. So it was very much an up and down, and then the down was much more acute, and I think that's what people kind of got. That's what definitely destabilized the country.
And it was also a period during which the internet was becoming more mainstream, and also computers to some extent. From my perspective, as growing up in South Africa in a rural town during that decade, I remember going to computer classes after school, where you sat for an hour to learn how a computer works, this new type of technology that nobody knows, but everyone is increasingly getting introduced into their homes. And then also the internet also started becoming more mainstream, also opening up a lot of new avenues for discussion and people getting exposed to new ideas, and a lot of new exposure to American culture from a different angle. I mean, it's pretty much amplified America's cultural imperialism across the world. You could see through the internet. So for me, that period in South Africa's history is also a period of remarkable change. My 2 main memories, or how I remember that period, even though I was young, was the fact that it was a time when what we call in South Africa Rainbowism or like the Rainbow Nation, that sentiment was still very much alive. The economy was growing, things were developing, things were going forward. There wasn't a lot of unrest. There was some cases of corruption, very high profile in some regard, but at the same time, nothing compared to what we have today. A lot of people genuinely believed that things were going to be all right, and they were believing in the liberal dream that was sold to them in the 90s in regards to South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the 2000s was, I mean, you can kind of look at the 2000s as, and I know we don't want to go back too far, but you can kind of look at it as a bit of an extension of the 90s, as kind of this moment in time in which you had almost triumphalism, and following the fall of the Soviet Union, America and the West was effectively a hyperpower. It really had never really been seen on that scale before in the world. It really did seem that the everything will eventually just kind of drift towards liberal capitalist market democracy, and that there's not going to be any kind of deep political or philosophical conversations. It's just going to be, all right, it'll be pragmatic policy discussions. That'll basically be it. But the big framework is one. It's one.
It's like Francis Fukuyama describing it as the end of history. And I know that happened a bit earlier than the 2000s, but that's pretty much the sentiment that was still very much believed up until even deep into that decade.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you have this at the end of history. You have, I think Fukuyama had his finger on the pulse there, and I think in some ways kind of was very emblematic of that, which was not this understanding of vertical history as this very contingent thing. It shifts around a lot. Everything seems great until it doesn't, and that was kind of, if I could sum up the 2000s in one sentence, that would probably be it. You have this situation in which, okay, the economies are booming, a lot of countries are doing great, and in America, you really saw the how do I put this? The not reemergence, but the re-endorsement, perhaps, of the American dream. This idea of opportunity, and look, everyone can buy a house, and the question was never like, oh, is the economy getting better? In a sense of our factories opening and jobs coming back. It's like, no, the jobs are going overseas, but you can buy a house on debt. But no one really wants to be the party pooper who's like, well, this doesn't seem sustainable. Everyone just bought in. And you saw that mania continue up until the great financial crisis. Everything looked great until it didn't. And so you saw this really profound shift from not boundless, but pretty significant optimism to one of really significant pessimism, and a question of was the last decade and a half even real? Did it actually, not that it didn't really happen, but was anything that we discussed there, was that American dream ever real, or was it something that the banks created to give us more loans? And I think that disillusionment really set the stage for the 2010s. But I mean, you're looking at almost this 15-year endorsement of the American dream, of opportunity, of that, and it just gets ripped away in the span of 15 months.
And a lot of significant things happened during that time. And something that I think is an interesting point to mention is the fact that if I think back in regards to the big happenings of that period that I remember, even though I was very young, I remember two two events very clearly. As a South African, I remember specifically the attack on 9/11. I remember the burning towers on every television. I couldn't watch my state broadcast television. And secondly, I remember the invasion of Iraq. I remember specifically the images of those troops moving in there and burning buildings and bombs being dropped. And that actually shows quite significantly how even some guy in rural South Africa, two of the main things that he remembers are two of the main events within the history of the American empire during that time. And it stuck with me. If you had to ask me two major world events that happened during that time that I vividly remember, it's two events regarding America.
Yeah, I mean, it's and you know, to an extent, 9/11 almost was I mean, you know, any kind of internal problems were kind of for a moment shifted outward. You know, you have an external enemy attacked us in the worst attack on American soil by a foreign enemy since Pearl Harbor, and you have, I mean, it, and you're right, it became an event of importance, and you know, the one wonders what would have happened without the Iraq invasions. So it's, you know, I think the 2000s was I think that people don't give it the time of day at times, you know, and even, you know, if you're looking at what are the biggest events of the 2000s, you know, you have 9/11, you have the invasion of Iraq, you have the great financial crisis, but you have the birth of, you have the first smartphone. You know, you have the iPhone, which I think was either 2007 or 2008 came out.
Yeah.
And, you know, for the first time, you have the internet really in your pocket. I mean, I remember my first phone had one of those, you know, I begged my parents for the one with the sliding keyboard, you know, and that was like the height of coolness back then. You know, years old, you know, you wanted that sliding keyboard, but you know, it was basically like phone calls and text messages, and that was it.
Yeah, my first phone had an antenna.
Yeah, and it really is shocking to see the difference, you know, between kind of the emergence of smartphones and cell phones, even just the emergence of cell phones to the emergence of smartphones. I mean, even you know, social media as well kind of exploded during that time period. I mean, you saw a radical transformation in the foreign policy sphere. You saw a radical shift in the economic sphere, and you saw a radical shift in the social sphere. I mean, the networks. Sorry, the networks of how people relate to one another changes dramatically with the increased proliferation of the internet, with smartphones. I mean, those two things are tied intricately together. And when you start looking at this, I mean, I think the 2000s set up, you know, the 2010s very directly. I mean, you can look at long-term trends, and one always should. But the number of contingent events that could have went the other way. I mean, one of the things when we look at, one thing I like to look at when I look at crises is, and I know this sounds stupid, but how popular is this period for alternate history people? If you go on forums, because there are certain periods that everyone like cares about. You know, the Civil War in America, the First Great War, the Second Great War. These are all really big. And one of the really big ones, and you can say that this is recency bias, but I really do think that it, especially considering how many of the people on these forums they didn't really live through them, and they're still popular. I think that, you know, you see people talk about 9/11 in Iraq all the time. You know, what if Gore won? What if Cheney had a heart attack and, you know, Bush decided that Iraq was not going to happen? What if 9/11 didn't happen? What if the American intelligence agencies stopped feuding like little girls and actually shared data with each other and stopped the attack? And I think that it was very much a crisis decade, and when you look at that, there's so many contingencies there that while the long-term trends matter, I think that America, whether it knew it or not, I think the West broadly, whether it knew it or not, made conscious decisions to dig its own grave during that decade.
Yeah, well, in my own neck of the woods in southern Africa, in this region, another major event that I remember, if I had to highlight an event that I remember from my own continent during that time, it was the expropriation without compensation in Zimbabwe, and Rhodesian, white farmers being chased off their land and murdered and attacked, and the absolute collapse overnight, practically, of Zimbabwe. During that time, I remember that also very vividly, and the effect that had on South African society specifically towards views toward the ANC. Because during that time, Thabo Mbeki was president, and his stance towards Zimbabwe in that time was a stance now referred to as soft diplomacy, where he just said, "No, I'm in talks with Mugabe. Don't worry. I'm monitoring this." A very Trumpian way of "I'm monitoring the situation. Don't worry." But no real effort to stop it. Pretty much from anyone on the outside, well, anyone looking at the administration would describe it as someone just watching it happen, not encouraging it, but also not doing anything to stop it. And what's one of the people in the Solidarity Movement, Flip Buys, wrote in his book, he said, what happened there in Zimbabwe was actually a pretty significant event in regards to South Africa's trajectory, because it showed us what the type of policies that the ANC are proposing today will lead to. So it was kind of a little bit of a political vaccine in regards to people's views on, for example, the policy of expropriation without compensation. I don't think people would be, there would definitely be still a strong resistance against it today, but I don't think it would be as strong if the Zimbabwean case didn't exist. And I remember very specifically the amount of refugees flowing into South Africa during that time, and the absolute chaos on in our neighboring country, and people being very sobered up in regards to, I mean, you have to take into context, these people are still high on Rainbowism. They're pretty much still, South Africa is going to be the exception on this very chaotic and bloody continent. But then you see this happening right next door, and it's being perpetrated by a party that is actually very good friends with your ruling party. You start sobering up very quickly. It's like when you're drunk and one of your mates gets hurt, or you're in an actual serious situation. How quickly you sober up when that happens. I think that's also was a big sobering experience for South Africans during that time, and I remember it very vividly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people. There's lots of debates over, different kinds of how is America supposed to be built, and I find it interesting you've probably heard this. America is an idea, and it's you're kind of sitting there, and you're like, well. And this is the problem with that, is that when you start drilling down with these people, they don't actually mean that. They really truly don't. Because you start going, well, if America is an idea, then that means that you have to believe in America, in this particular idea, to be an American. And the implication is that if you don't believe in it, you're not an American. And you start seeing these people go, whoa, wait a second. That's not what we're saying. Yeah, and really, it's these shifting goalposts to accommodate greater and greater, Rainbowism. I think that's a good word, in which you have this dream that you can just kind of throw people together and it'll work, or it'll work this time. There have been plenty of attempts to do that in the past, and they don't work. And the question, of course, people compare America to a lot of different places. I mean, I think one that probably hasn't been compared to enough is like the Ottoman Empire, is this kind of sclerotic, almost rotting, old imperial, because America is an empire. it's not a nation, it is an empire. I'm not talking about, its territories. Like the 50 states are an empire. It's a group of separate nations controlled by a set of imperial capitals. And you end up seeing this, these shifting goalposts to accommodate this as more and more, as you see more and more external attacks, you see more and more circling the wagons. And I think that one of the things that the 2000s were largely a period of almost reconciliation, where it also was probably the height of recent rainbowism, in the sense that, and of course it was due to predatory loans, but like the black home ownership rate was going up, crime was going down, again largely due to significant crime bills and things, but it seemed as if people were getting along and things were going along pretty well, and then it all just started falling apart. And the, whether it was 9/11, that kind of started again the whole outsider, friend enemy began coming back a little bit more. But I mean, there is a profound shift in how people, different groups of people, relate to each other. And so I think that height of rainbowism, which really was probably in the 90s, but extended into the 2000s, just kind of collapses. I think that if you took someone who was put in a cryo chamber in 2000 and you woke them up in 2020 and you showed them race relations in the US, they would be like, what the fuck happened?
Yeah.
I mean,
everything was going so well.
Yeah, it was. For a short period of time. I mean, you talk about America's storied past with race and then immigration, all of this, and you would assume that, okay, these tensions are always going to be there. But for a brief period of time, it seemed as if everything was going to be fine. It seemed as if, yes, there's lots of work that needs to be done, and because there's certain, like a city like Detroit is basically bombed out, looks like a war zone, and needs to be fixed. But like these are pragmatic concerns. They're not philosophical ones. It seemed as if we'd settled. It's just, okay, we're all good, shake hands, and let's work as a country to move forward. And then it just kind of disappeared. More than kind of, it's gone. Whatever that brief period of time was, that I'm not sure if I experienced the very end of it. I grew up in a fairly rural town as well. There wasn't a lot of race relation discussions there. I'm Native American, but most of the town was white, and I don't look particularly ethnic, for lack of a better word. And it was just kind of like, okay, you're just you're just another person. So there was this rapid shift later. And so I think that, in terms of rainbowism, I think that the real debate is where did it go wrong? I think 9/11 is part of it. But I also think that, there's battle lines that got drawn that weren't particularly foreseeable, whether that was, the extension of gender debates. I'm not sure. There's a lot of things that happened in that period. I mean, maybe Tumblr is the root of all evil. Who knows?
Absolutely. And there was, I remember also specifically something that's still a problem in South Africa today is the rolling blackouts. And what we call very euphemistically load shedding. It started in 2008, so we've had rolling blackouts every year for the past 13 years. A lot of children that are 13 years old now, 12 years old now, don't know a South Africa without rolling blackouts. And this I don't know why, but coincidentally, it coincides with the global financial crisis as well. That's when South Africa also started uh, exiting the Rainbowism phase and entering we're ruled by socialist kleptocrats phase, where people slowly start becoming more sober to the fact that our government is not the government that was sold to us by the media and by the international community in regards to these great selfless humanitarians, and they're going to take care of property rights and freedom of speech and all these nice classical liberal values. And they value the Constitution, but that's a whole different debate. And then what pretty much happened at near the end of the 2000s was Jacob Zuma comes into power, who was now sentenced to prison for contempt of court charges, sparking a lot of these riots, even though the riots are far away from being about Zuma anymore. But that was kind of the period where South Africans started realizing that not started realizing, it kind of dawned on them again, oh shit, I live in Africa. For that first decade of the 2000s, it was pretty much, we're going to be different. We're going to be a little vessel of, I don't know, civilization on the continent, and then all the regular tropes and patterns and stuff start emerging again. You realize, but your government is increasingly looking exactly like every other government on the continent. But that's pretty much the 2000s, and then that lays the groundwork for the 2010s. Now, in America,
one of the things I remember is I remember when you guys where it was like the BRICS. Remember that? The whole economic, it was like Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And the narrative was from basically the mid 2000s on, was like these 5 countries, are going to be the engine of global growth, and in each one of them at China and India and Asia, South Africa and Africa, Brazil and South America, they're going to be the standard bearers for their continent, and they're going to help lead the continent up into, Western levels of economic development. And these are going to be the countries that we really turn to for the next wave of global growth. And then, what happened? Brazil is, they had their own socialist president, and then Bolsonaro, and neither one of them have done particularly well. And South Africa, you've been discussing the whole set of problems there. Really, it's China. China's the only one that has actually maintained any kind of growth. And the question, of course, is, are those growth numbers even accurate? Are they real, or have they at least been partially made up? It really is fascinating to watch the collapse of optimism from that early 2000s period through, I think, once the Iraq War started going from, we're going to go in and like the U.S. the coalition destroyed the Iraqi army very quickly. And then you're like, well, how do you build a nation? And it's like, oh, that's easy. We did it in 1776. We'll do it again. And not realizing that, that's not how these things work. And so you get this you get this significant problem, that set of problems that emerges, and the optimism just slowly starts fading away. I think it was 2006 in the US that saw the Democrats sweep a huge number of elections. And you really started seeing this kind of continual breakdown of optimism, and then you get to the 2010s, and good God, what a decade!
Would you call the election of Barack Obama, as we're talking about, kind of going into 2010s now? In 2008, the election of Barack Obama, would you call that, as they say in stocks, a dead cat bounce in terms of optimism?
I think that Obama was almost like the last gasping breath of that optimism, which was the idea that, okay, you finally have a black president. Great. Race relations hadn't deteriorated yet, not to the extent that we saw in the 2010s. was a reaction to Barack Obama part of it? Yeah, but I don't think that Barack Obama is the reason race relations in America are bad. I think that what ended up happening was there was this last gasp. I mean, Obama came to power on the idea of hope. I mean, I still remember the very first time I was ever aware of the president was that election. I didn't really know. I'd heard my parents mention it, but I was 11 in 2008. I had very vague awareness of what politics was, and I so I remember sitting in the family room of our house as we watched the election, and it was very strange, and it was such a different time period, such a different shift. And I mean, he won convincingly, and John McCain shook his hand and was like, "Well done, like you won, congrats." And I think that people had the hope that Obama would save us from the last couple years of tumult. He would save us from the Iraq War. He would save us from the great financial crisis, and then he didn't. I mean, nothing. He bailed out the banks, and then they gave their executives golden parachutes, and he bailed out the auto lenders, who then continued to ship jobs overseas, or put them in Mexico, and he passes a healthcare plan that was a Republican plan 5 years ago, and this idea of Obama as kind of not necessarily revolutionary, but really truly an optimistic, galvanizing figure begins to disappear very rapidly. And you start seeing this, and you start seeing this across the spectrum, which is the rise of the Tea Party. Mr. Patriarch, yes, Obama ended up being this face of neoliberalism. It's a very good way of putting it. He ended up
Andrew Breitbart's also in his prime during this time.
Yeah, I mean, he ended up being, he could speak really, really well, and that's, he could give a speech that would get people up on their feet. And again, it seemed as if he, a large swath of the country. I mean, you compare how the country reacts to Barack Obama to just think like 50 years earlier, this is impossible. Like a black man in 1958 trying to become president. I mean, ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And the answer is, I think that he ended up having. He ended up taking all of that optimism, bundling it up, and then just stabbing it in the back. And you end up getting, on the left, you end up getting Occupy Wall Street. On the right, you started getting the Tea Party. And really, again, these are expressions of similar feelings, which is this betrayal of the optimism, this betrayal of the American dream. I mean, the Occupy Wall Street is very much this idea of the power of opportunity and of social mobility has collapsed in the United States. It has been, everything has been taken over by these wealthy bankers who don't even produce anything. I mean, at the very least, you could have went to John Rockefeller or Vanderbilt and been like, they built an actual industrial empire. Like, yes, maybe they're monopolists and that needs to be stopped, but at least they built something. I mean, Jamie Dimon is a literal vampire. Like there's nothing really that he's built, besides financializing the global economy. And so you get that side of the betrayal of the American dream, and then you get the other side, which is the Tea Party, which are like part of the American dream is opportunity, and we can't have opportunity if the government is in our lives everywhere, and all of this stuff, and so different, they're reflections of their underlying ideology, but they're reacting to the same thing, which is this idea that the American dream has been ruthlessly murdered, in the dead of the night. And there's disagreements about who did it. Was it the government, corporations, both? Or But I really do think that Obama was kind of
Yeah.
that last gasping breath of optimism that just he snuffed it out.
Hmm. Apex, I told you at the beginning, or I told you in the chat at the beginning of the stream that these more casual conversations actually bring to the fore quite a few enlightening ideas. And what I've realized so far from this chat is how much South Africa and America mirrors each other in regards to the tides of the time. So I'll go get a bit into that. So seeing as we discussed Obama as being like this last grasp at that positivity around 2008. Around 2010, South Africa hosts the football or soccer World Cup. And it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same, just as you described Obama's presidency, pretty much, or that election in regards to national morale. Exactly the same happens in 2010 in South Africa. So what happens is the whole world is watching. We put on a show, and all South Africans feel again, yeah, we have some rolling blackouts, but they've stopped now this year, very coincidentally, during the World Cup. No rolling blackouts suddenly. Crime also is way down because there's a shit ton of more police on the streets now that there's a lot of tourists here. People are lulled back again and like, don't worry, the bad stuff that's happened at the tail end of the previous decades was just a glitch. It's not a feature. And people start thinking again, no, the next decade is going to be great. I mean, the motto of that tournament was it's time for Africa. And I can guarantee you from my own experience, a lot of people were genuinely believing it. They thought like this is the next big thing. South Africa is back, baby. And then just 2 years later, in 2012, the ANC announced that they are now entering phase 2 of the National Democratic Revolution. So just quick context for the listeners that are not South African. The National Democratic Revolution is pretty much the ideological Bible and framework of the ANC. They got it from the Soviets. And it's the plan of, to put it very simply, almost insultingly simply, is you gain power through democracy and under the guise of classical liberal values. Once in power, you start enacting more and more socialist policies. You use socialism as like the metaphor of the boiling frog, slowly getting people used to socialist policies through normalization, and then next you enact full-blown communism, and and then people will. It's like that recipe for how to destroy a nation by Yuri Bezmenov, pretty much in just a different form, also from the minds of Soviets. But anyway, so in 2012, the ANC announced phase 2 of the NDR, so that's pretty much socialism just being a lot more explicit in the ANC's rhetoric and in their policies. And during that time as well, a lot of corruption scandals are coming to the fore regarding Jacob Zuma and things for that little blip. And that's why it's so enlightening to me that now that I've heard you describe how the Obama election, the effect that had on the zeitgeist in America, that's why it's so strange, because it's exactly the feature, or that's exactly how I remember 2010's World Cup in South Africa, and how quickly things fell apart just a few years later.
Yeah, I mean, I think I remember the 2010 World Cup. I remember watching it. I think I think I was rooting for the Netherlands, if I remember properly. I liked their orange uniforms when I was 13. I was like, those are cool. I'm gonna root for those guys. But I really think that it was, and funny enough, I was watching it. I was visiting my grandparents down in Florida, and they lived in this I'm gonna call it a compound. Like it was a neighborhood for people who were elderly and had already retired, and it, like, looking back, just the kind of gradual decline of like the common areas in that space, just kind of like the growing disrepair was not something that as a child I really understood. It was something I noticed a little bit. The pool would get a little bit grosser each year, and it's really quite a thing where I think 2 years seems to be that kind of breakdown period, which is from 2008 to 2010 in the U.S. was kind of that shift in, okay, well, Obama came in, and by but within 2 years, the optimism was dead. And for you guys, it was 2010 to 2012. And then, I mean, I think that as we enter the 2010s, which is a cursed decade, for the U.S. and for South Africa and for much of the world, I think that you start seeing the decline, and I think that in many ways this is you see this tension in the 2012 election in the U.S. This idea of the Republican Party nominates the most white bread, buttoned up person imaginable, and Mitt Romney. He's not a bad guy, but he has no connection to the zeitgeist whatsoever. He has no connection to the frustration that people feel across the spectrum. And yet, because of the fact that Obama really betrayed the optimism, he gets closer than McCain does. And I think the Washington Post ran this story that Romney actually won some key demographics among like the 18 to 24-year-olds, like the really young first or second time voters in the U.S. And he won some of those demographics, which is ridiculous for, you think a white old Republican versus Barack Obama, this vision of hope and progress, and it's just dead at this point. And you start seeing the gradual collapse. I mean, I think that one of the problems post great financial crisis, post collapse of optimism, and I think it's one of the reasons why some people still believe in the Fukuyama thesis, is that no one has really presented anything new. I mean, there's appeals to, we just need to embrace Reaganism, or resurrect FDR and let him do something, or something like that. But there's very little questioning of kind of that philosophical grounding, and I think that when you've lost so much optimism, when the zeitgeist has turned so negative, you kind of hold on to those core values more deeply, because no one wants to admit that they got duped. No one wants to admit. I didn't see the name, but someone mentioned the in your chat mentioned the quote earlier. The American dream, you have to be asleep to believe it. And I think that the problem is that no one wants to admit that they got duped. No one wants to admit that they were wrong, that they were lied to. And the response to this, of course, is that they hold to those core values much more tightly. They hold to this idea of no, there's a real America that just needs to be saved. There's a real West, there's a real European Union dream that needs to be saved. And if you just embrace austerity for a little bit longer, and Greece gets its wallet in order, like, it'll be fine, guys, we promise. And then it wasn't, and then it wasn't. And I remember the Obama red line in Syria. And then the whole, obviously we still have I don't know what the chemical attack was, but there was a chemical attack by someone against civilians. I remember that whole disaster of a period, and then half of America is like, Obama looks weak, and the other half isn't even going like, America can't hold on to an empire anymore, guys. Like, it's done. We need to regroup and pull back. There was no questioning those central assumptions of what the world looked like. And this kind of flailing at problems, flailing in the air, was shockingly prevalent, and still is to a degree. I mean, it's one of the things that I find very interesting, and you can look at this through a lens of not, it's an economics book, it's on economic psychology and sociology, but you can look at this through a lens of politics as well. So the author is Jens Beckert. It's called Imagined Futures. But basically, what Beckert describes is that you need people to picture themselves in an attainable and desirable future to actually motivate them to take steps to get there. But if they perceive it as not being attainable at all, interestingly, one, they will become more apathetic. They'll just kind of dream. But two, their dreams will become more and more extravagant. And I see a parallel there with the visions of people through the 2010s that's developed, as it almost appears that, trust in media has collapsed. Trust in any institution really has collapsed. In the US, you had the NSA scandal. It's like, yeah, we're spying on millions of our own citizens. And did anything happen? No. You had Donald Trump. You have all of these kind of explosions of anger, but nothing really changes. And I see more and more of these kinds of extravagant dreams as people perceive the attainability of a reformed culture as slipping away more and more. And so you get this kind of delusional thinking rising throughout the 2010s, and I honestly see that trend accelerating, because how do you effectively need to start demolishing bureaucracies in order to get anywhere? You have these systems that are not just bloated and dysfunctional, but they're everywhere, and they're ineffective, and you basically have to destroy them. And so as the optimism dies, it wasn't just like, okay, well, the country needs to regroup. It eventually shifts from the optimism dies, and then over the course of the 2010s, the pessimism just kind of intensifies to an incredible degree. Donald Trump didn't really do much of anything. He was a fairly weak president. He got a few things done. There were some benefits, but he comes in and he basically capitulates to the RNC. He capitulates to his son-in-law, and Biden comes in promising a bunch of stuff, promising student loan reform and all of this stuff. And what has he done? His stimulus checks were smaller than Trump's, and they tried to get out of their promises. They weaseled out of it with some stupid, we just promised $2,000 in total, not $2,000 checks. Shut up. Don't look at pictures of us or videos of us promising that in the past. And it's one of those things where, like, there's no questioning of the central assumptions or central ideas, because to question that is to admit tacitly that you have been duped, that you got tricked, that you bought into something that was wrong, and that's uncomfortable. In many cases, it can lead to almost an existential crisis, and so you end up getting this really despairing decade as battle lines start getting drawn, as they deepen and intensify, and then you end up getting probably one of the most damaging and damning problems, which is that now that there's no common ground to even begin from anymore. It's basically just been burnt down and the ground has been salted. And I'm not sure what you do. I talked about the delusional thinking. I'm certainly guilty of that at times. You envision a Caesar walking up and kind of blowing away the old bureaucracies and resetting the ground, and then kind of just going, all right, well, America's back, baby, and then letting there be local control, and the Caesar just kind of sits back and drinks wine or whatever Caesars do in their off time. And it's certainly, like, it's appealing, because there's this idea of, like, there's a level of, okay, well, we just need to wipe away this stuff, we'll be fine. And is that going to happen? Of course not. It's not going to happen. I mean, look at the American military now. What the hell is going on there? We're basically purging our military of wrongthink. It's like, well, that's a great sign. And the 2010s is a decade of profound decline. There is no optimism left. There is no. I mean, America never recovered from 2008. Never recovered from 2001. Didn't recover from 2003. And you start adding these things up, and you get a decade of, I mean, the opioid crisis. I'm not sure if South Africa had something similar to an opioid crisis in the past couple decades.
We've got a crisis with a lot heavier drugs.
Yeah. I mean, these huge swaths of the country that just get left behind. It's like, oh, you weren't economically efficient enough. Sorry, sucks to be you. The extra profits will go to New York and Los Angeles and Boston and DC, and your town will just kind of slowly die out, and you're, good luck, have fun. And it's I mean, and you see these. I mean, I think that people started really looking deeply into problems. I mean, if I remember from the last set of data that I saw, like, even the racial wealth gap in the US, black and white, has not closed as a percentage by like more than 0.5% since the 1960s. Like, it's shocking how badly we've done. It's absolutely shocking. And I think that there was this gradual, not even gradual, there was just this complete disillusionment of what is America, and it's, I think that from the way you've described South Africa, and is very similar, is, what is this country? What actually is going on? Not the vision of the country, but what is the country actually like? And the answer is whatever positivity there was is gone. And I think the 2020s are probably going to be worse than the 2010s, at least in America. Can't predict for South Africa, but it's shocking.
Well, in South Africa as well, you get, during the 2010s, you get the state capture scandal, which is pretty much the biggest corruption scandal in South Africa's history, where the entire state apparatus was captured by the president and his cronies and sapped dry. Then there's nothing left. But there's something else that I wanted to mention, something that a lot of people have not picked up on, something that I remember very vividly from the 2010s, but it's almost as if it's just been wiped from memory. It's been memory hold, and it feels like I'm describing something from my past where I've just phased in from a different timeline. And that's two debates, or two topics. I don't know what word to use. The one is terrorist attacks, radical Islamic terrorist attacks in Europe and in America.
Yes.
And the other one is school shootings, with the whole gun debate. So the terror attacks leads to debates surrounding immigration, debates surrounding cultural assimilation, debates surrounding the radical aspects of religion, and the school shootings aspect. You get a lot of debate surrounding the gun violence, basically, and the First Amendment, or the Second Amendment. So now we get into the 2020s, and it's just gone. I remember very vividly, and like I said, it feels like I'm losing my mind describing this time. I remember on a set 2-weekly basis having a major terrorist attack in Europe or in America or somewhere in the West.
Yeah.
And I remember at least once a month a major school shooting somewhere in America, and it's just gone.
Yeah. I think that the first two topics, I think there has been one, you saw that starting in the middle of the 2010s, you start seeing this shift. You start seeing a shift towards, for lack of a better term, populism in the US, in Europe. You start seeing Brexit. You see Trump. You see Orban. You see Le Pen start, nearly defeat Macron, and I think that to a degree there is this feeling um, there. It was a combination of immigration did somewhat decline in the latter half of the decade, partially off of the back of these populist groups, but the second was that the Blue Empire, the media and academia and all of that kind of united in this. We're not really going to cover it. I mean, there still are. You can look in France that there still were in 2019, up until basically the pandemic started. There still were, you'd hear rural churches got burnt or something like that, and it was there, and I think that was a huge. You're right. I think that was a huge part of the rise of populism today. I mean, the migrant crisis in Europe, especially, and then the school shooting side. I mean, I'm not going to get into Alex Jones territory. I mean that's his battlefield. But I mean, there are certainly weird things about a number. I mean, one of the perhaps even more memory hold than the school shootings was Las Vegas. I mean, this guy
Absolutely.
opens
I mean,
fire with 15 guns in a hotel room. How did he get there? No one has any idea. He opens up with like 15 guns. He kills like 60 people with pretty precise shooting, and no one talks about it. We still have no idea what that was, and it is shocking in a way that few things are shocking. You're kind of like, well, wouldn't people care about this? And I mean, I think part of it is, the school shooting is definitely stopped because no one's in school. And I'm going to be honest with you, I think that you're going to see a hell of a lot more of them in the 2020s as people return, because the psychological damage that the lockdowns have done to children is going to scar much of the world. I'm very confident in saying that the 2020s and 2030s will not be a fun period of time in terms of violence from young people. I think that you're talking about a huge amount of developmental damage that was done. And I see them intensifying once again. I don't know if you're going to end up seeing a spike in terror attacks, Islamic or otherwise, in the 2020s, but I do think you're going to end up seeing a spike in those kinds of shootings. And I mean, I think the problem is that America continues to. I mean, you're going to end up getting more and more calls for gun control, and the problem is that most gun violence in the U.S. has two bases. It has a a mental health basis. There's mental health based, and then it has an economic basis. But of course, America, half of America doesn't want to spend money, and the other half is more concerned with feeling like a moral superior than it is to solving any kind of problem. And so you end up getting this really quite problematic set of circumstances, and it really is. I mean, I think that they certainly contributed. I think that they're probably going to come back. But I mean, I would not be shocked if the 2020s saw the rise of a different wave of terrorist attacks. Like I don't want to say like the Islamic attacks are almost a fad, but I feel as if you're going to end up seeing more. I wouldn't be shocked if you saw more of a return to the late 20th century, where you saw more attacks from the likes of political radicals, from the likes of ecological radicals. I would not be shocked. Someone will probably blow up a pipeline in the U.S. in the 2020s if they ever get approved. Someone will almost certainly do that, or they will attempt to. FBI, this is not an actual. I am not threatening this. Do not get angry at me or Caracol. Thank you, but something to keep an eye on, my friends at the FBI. But it's like I really do think that you're going to end up seeing intensifying calls for gun control, and I wouldn't be shocked if Biden does it, but I also wouldn't be shocked if he doesn't do it. Could America go into another economic collapse? Perhaps. I don't know. I don't know how long this inflation is going to last. So,
that's the type of stuff that's going to be the questions and the big discussions of the decade ahead. I mean, we just freshly entered the 2020s, and we entered them in style with a global disaster or crisis. But the sad thing is that unfortunately, I don't think people can prepare for what the future holds, because at the moment things are just too chaotic. People, even the big brains out there, can't really predict what's coming down the pipeline, because it seems the news cycle is just accelerating. From a South African perspective,
from an American one as well, I can definitely second that.
Yeah, and it feels almost like there's like a final act on the way, but not a final act in the way like the end of the world or apocalyptic, but rather some if the current time that we're living was a film, you're approaching the final act of the film. Now there might be a sequel and 3 or 5, or even like a Fast and Furious franchise still on the way, but it feels like
we're going back to space.
We're coming to a close. Something big is happening. I remember this tweet from I can't remember his name. His profile picture is like a little snake that's been drawn, and he made this tweet of like all these projections from the UN, when all these things like global food security, and all these different crises on this one graph. He mapped them, and all these little graphs kind of dip and intersect what he called the apocalypse spaghetti intersect at 2030. We're gonna see what's down the pipeline. You and me are gonna be alive to see it.
That's I forget the name of it, but that is a very famous study. I forget. Someone can probably find it and will retweet it or something. It was a very famous study there, and I think that we will see. I mean, I think that the question comes down to, can people build the institutions necessary to get through this final act? I mean, because really what we're in is we're in a transition period. I think that's what we're both grasping at least in our countries. And that final act of the transition is coming. And the question is, what's going to be there in the next play? What's going to be there after the transition is done? And what does that mean? The stage will be set once again. The game will the timer starts and the game is on. So it's a question, and it's a question of how long this transitory period lasts. It's so difficult when you're in the middle of history to understand where history is going. But
hindsight is incredible superpower.
Yeah. And it's so I think we'll end up seeing some very interesting stuff over the next 10 years. And one can only pray for the survival of the best aspects of our countries and of the world, really.
Absolutely, and that's why these types of conversations are necessary, because in the end, as you said at the beginning of this chat, A lot of people they like to focus on like the big events of the 20th century, but at the same time, a lot of significant stuff have happened in our very recent past, and I think they're going to echo into the future. So you better start and I think this is why conversations like this are very important, because it serves as a type of time capsule for future internet historians to go back and see how people in the present were analyzing and making sense of what was happening around them at that time. So I think this is very valuable. It's a very small contribution to the bigger picture, but I like the fact of I like the approach of approaching conversations as time capsules for the future, for, like I said, future internet archaeologists to comb through. And maybe just a final thought there to add to what you said there. There's a quote from Solzhenitsyn that I encountered this week that I think I tweeted it out, but it goes that there is but one choice to rise to the task of the age. And I think that's something that a lot of my viewers can take away from tonight's conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Solzhenitsyn's a great author, great speaker. Definitely a good quote you chose there. And if anyone is interested, Solzhenitsyn's commencement address at Harvard in the 1970s, I think it was 1976.
I know it, yeah.
Yeah, very good speech. I highly recommend everyone read it if you haven't already. But I suppose, are we wrapping up now?
Yeah, just before we wrap up, I just need to put a little bit of a sponsor slot in here, seeing as I've been fortunate enough to have my show sponsored by a business,
aren't you
South
lucky?
African business. Well, I actually know the owners of the business, and they're good guys. So like I've told my audience, I'm not just going to accept any type of sponsorship to make money. It has to be a good thing, and I have to know the people behind it, and that's the case with this. So just a quick commercial break, and that's the fact that Stream of Consciousness has now a sponsor through Bitvice, who is the only platform in South Africa that allows you to buy Bitcoin and have it sent to you to your own self-custody by default. This means that you are exposed to zero counterparty risk, which is typically associated with someone else holding your Bitcoin for you. Your Bitcoin is much safer from hacks, confiscation, and regulatory capture when you self-custody it yourself. Bitvice offers hands-on guidance for setting up your self-custody solution. We will hold your hand setting up your wallet if need be, or point you to the best solutions available on the market today if you would rather do it yourself. Bitvice offers the highest referral fee in South Africa for sending us clients our way. If you wish to get your friends and family involved in Bitcoin and want them to hold their Bitcoin in their own self-custody wallet, send them to us and we will pay a 0.25% of their order value in Bitcoin for every order they make. So you can find a link in the description. Thank you once again to the good guys at Bitvice for sponsoring the show. Thanks a lot. But yeah, Apex, thank you very much for your time as well. Thank you for the very enlightening conversation. I actually had quite a few little mini epiphanies when I in this way contrast your experience from the US perspective and my own experience from South Africa. A lot of things that I have to think about after tonight, that I think there's some things there that still needs a lot of analysis. But thank you very much for your time, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me. It was great. It was nice talking to you. Again, it was, I'll echo the same sentiment hearing about South Africa and your experiences is it's really interesting to see those comparisons and contrasts and kind of project forward what the next decade might look like. So thank you again. Really appreciate it. And I really enjoyed our conversation.
And then also I'm going to give you the opportunity so you don't have to ask like a schmuck. You now have the shilling opportunity. So tell the listeners where they can find you if they like your ideas.
Yes, so I'm on Twitter, Apex_Synapse, as well as I have a Substack, apexesnotes.substack.com. I try to write at least once or twice weekly, and on a variety of topics, largely concerned with political philosophy, current events, that kind of stuff. So if you're interested, that's where you can find me. And I'm happy to engage in comments, engage on Twitter and all that stuff. I like hearing other perspectives. So, and I want to thank Carrickle again for bringing me on. Very kind of him, and hopefully we can talk again in the future, perhaps when both of our countries are in a little bit of a better state. Although I don't know how much longer that'll be.
Hmm. Well, we're going to have to see what the timeline brings. But for those that are too lazy to search those terms that Apex just described, I've taken the liberty to put the links in the description. It's just a click away. I can highly recommend it. Like I said, just as with sponsorships, whenever I shill someone's channel or content, is because I actually enjoy it and consume it myself. So thank you very much also to the audience for tuning in. Your questions and your commentary have been top class as always. I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. If you're in South Africa, stay safe, stay mobilized, stay organized, know your neighbor's name, make sure you've got that contact network and safety network already in place. And if you haven't already, join a neighborhood watch. That's what you're going to have to do. But that's luckily for you, the structure is already in place. So everyone have a very nice evening. I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend, and God bless.